even get to noroviruses. So the rhinoviruses belong to that same P coronavirus group. Rhinoviruses are really common. Rhino, nose. They're common cause of common colds and also other upper respiratory infections. Of course, many of us have had a cold, maybe even recently, and they're usually self-limiting. You get better within a few days, and you really don't experience any severe disease. And so we could kind of differentiate like cold-like symptoms versus flu-like symptoms. When you have a cold, most of the time, you feel okay. Like you don't feel too tired, you don't feel achy, but you might feel congested, you might have a little bit of a sore throat. But when you have flu-like symptoms, that's when you have a fever, you're tired and achy, right? You have more of that like body involvement. So you can kind of, you've probably had both the cold and the flu. You can differentiate what it felt like when you had a cold versus when you have the flu. So cold-like illness versus a flu-like illness. These are different from enteroviruses. So remember, on Friday, we talked about other P coronaviruses that fall under that category of enteroviruses, where they are transmitted by the GI tract but cause symptoms elsewhere in the body, like hepatitis A, hand, foot, and mouth, polio. Okay. Well, the rhinoviruses are sensitive to stomach acid, so they cannot be transmitted through the fecal-oral route. They get destroyed. And they can't replicate in the GI tract anyway. So that's why they're limited to the upper respiratory tract. And in fact, they actually grow best or replicate best at 33 degrees. Remember, average human body temperature is 37. So the reason that we really often see cold viruses as being associated with the winter is because it's cooler in the winter. And so even when you inhale, right, your nose, what you're inhaling is a little bit cooler than the outside air. But when it's cold outside, it's even colder. And that is what allows these to maybe proliferate more in the winter, but also restricts them to the upper respiratory tract. If they get any farther down, it's too hot and they can't replicate as well. And again, they prefer the nasal mucosa, which is why a cold tends to be coughing and sneezing and nasal congestion or maybe a runny nose versus like a systemic not feeling well. But as we all probably know with colds, they are highly infectious. Inhalation of one virion can cause disease. So, people think I'm paranoid, like when I'm in the grocery store and somebody sneezes and I'm like, well, I guess I can't go down that aisle. Well, if they have a cold, I don't want it, so I'm not going to go down that aisle. Okay, one particle can cause disease. These are thought to be the cause of up to 1/2 of respiratory tract infections, upper respiratory tract infections. So when we talk about upper versus lower respiratory tract, upper respiratory tract, and basically like your voice box, your larynx, and up. Anything below your larynx is what I would call your lower respiratory tract. Some books will say right where your trachea splits into your bronchi, that would be lower, but I'm talking about basically your larynx and below is lower. Anything above is upper. Transmitted by aerosols and fomites. Okay, resistant to drying and detergents. So again, this is one of those, now that we're back in person and doing classes in person, I can, achoo, and then I like touch the doorknob as I'm leaving. Okay, ew. That's what happens. As one of my daughters would say, ew. Okay. But 50% of patients might even be asymptomatic, but still shedding viral particles and can spread the infection. So, it's always good to practice good hand hygiene. Hopefully after almost 4 years of a pandemic, we've learned how to wash our hands. If you have an Apple Watch, you can actually set it where it will tell you that it's been 20 seconds and you can stop now. Yeah, it's like washing hands for dummies. Get an Apple Watch, it'll tell you. Like, oh, okay, you're not done yet. Symptoms, again, would include headache. Sometimes you'll feel a little bit tired, sore throat, but you're not gonna feel that deep like body ache, that exhaustion that you get with the flu. But most commonly, sneezing, runny nose, all those nasal symptoms. Your peak symptoms will be 3 to 4 days after infection. It can last 7 to 10 days, but usually doesn't. Usually clears up in a few days. Almost certainly you wouldn't be diagnosed because you'd probably feel better before you made it to the doctor, but you can look for the virus in nasal secretions. No treatment available. Hand washing and disinfection are most helpful. So just practice good hand hygiene. Like Elmo says, you cough into your elbow. I watch too many kid shows, even Miss Rachel, cough into your elbow, cough into your shoulder. Don't and then touch stuff, please. Please. Okay. And if you do, if that's how you cough and sneeze, go wash your hands frequently, please. Okay, questions about rhinoviruses. Okay, and so the first part of the section on P coronaviruses, I uploaded the video. So if you want a refresher or you weren't here on Friday, you can refresh yourself on that. So P corona leads us right into coronaviruses. Coronaviruses get their name from the appearance under the microscope. Corona, like a crown, they look like, right? They've got that circle around them. They are the second most common cause of the cold. So coronaviruses are very, very common. Even prior to our most recent pandemic, coronaviruses were very common. The coronaviruses that we worry more about are SARS coronavirus number 2, and MERS, or Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. They are enveloped positive sense strand RNA viruses. So again, with that positive sense strand RNA virus, the genome is basically ready to be translated as soon as we get into the cell. So they don't have to bring their own polymerase with them. As soon as they get in, as soon as the virus uncoats and that RNA is released, it looks a lot like mRNA and can immediately be translated. Now, as an enveloped virus, you would probably think, well, coronaviruses then at least must be sensitive to stomach acid. So P coronaviruses, they're not enveloped, so they're not sensitive to stomach acid. But these are enveloped, so they should be sensitive to stomach acid, but they are not sensitive to stomach acid. They have proteins embedded in the envelope, glycoproteins, so proteins conjugated to carbohydrates, and it helps protect them from stomach acid, which means that coronaviruses can be transmitted through the fecal-oral route. And again, they're showing you just kind of classic RNA viral replication. The virus attaches, it uncoats, the genomic RNA can be translated. It will encode its own polymerase. The polymerase will allow it to be transcribed so you can make more genomic RNA, and then eventually exocytosis. They have a lot of different proteins involved in binding, transmembrane proteins. They have a polymerase. So again, as an enveloped virus, they should be sensitive to stomach acid, but they're not. Those glycoproteins really help. Now, in general, coronaviruses are a lot like rhinoviruses in that the optimum growth replication temperature is a little bit cooler than human body temperature, so 33 to 35. And that's why, for the most part, coronaviruses are limited to the upper respiratory tract, with a handful of exceptions. They will infect ciliated cells, and they will lead to death of the ciliated cells. So of course, in the lower respiratory tract, that's pretty dangerous because those ciliated cells are important for bringing mucus up and dropping it down. So by killing those cells, you can start to get lung congestion with the buildup of mucus. You can get secondary bacterial infections because you're not able to clear it. So it's a dangerous thing for a virus to be able to do. These are mostly spread by aerosols, but again, some of them can be spread through the fecal-oral route because they can survive the GI tract. The symptoms of a cold caused by a coronavirus are going to be very, very similar to those caused by a rhinovirus. You may have a slightly longer incubation period. So I guess, anecdotally, I ran into that person sneezed 2 days ago and I don't have symptoms yet, right? You can just start kind of tracking. Oh, it's been like 7 days and now I got symptoms. It's probably a coronavirus instead of a rhinovirus. But for the most part, again, it's not going to matter. It's a cold. Okay. Now, you might be thinking, okay, optimum growth and replication is at these lower temperatures. So why do we have this pandemic then that can kill people? Well, because we have some coronaviruses that are more dangerous. So SARS coronavirus 2, and MERS, they are cytolytic, so they cause cell death. And the difference here is that they can replicate at body temperature. So that allows them to be spread through the GI tract. It allows them to get lower into the respiratory tract. It allows them to cause viremia. So you can get much more severe disease because the virus can access more places because it can replicate at body temperature. These also tend to be what we call zoonoses, zoonotic infections. They come from animals. All three of these were originally found in animals and were able to make the jump into people. And they can infect lots of different kinds of cells, epithelial cells, lymphocytes, leukocytes. And they can cause damage to a number of different tissues, the lung, kidney, liver, GI tract. So they're way more dangerous than a cold. So the first one to talk about is SARS. SARS is an acronym for Sudden Acute Respiratory Syndrome. This was something that most of you probably were not alive when it actually happened. Or if you were very small, cute little babies, and you don't remember, and that's good. It caused an atypical pneumonia, so like it caused a lung infection, but it wasn't like a classic type of pneumonia that we see. Patients had high temperatures, chills, headache, difficulty breathing. Approximately 20% of patients would develop diarrhea, had an incubation period of about 10 days, mortality rate of approximately 10%, and kind of an unknown reservoir. We think mammals. We don't know exactly which ones. And what we had with SARS, so this was back in like 2002, 2003. And then the last cases were diagnosed in around 2004, and we've never seen it again. So it's like it disappeared. Where did it go? Is it gone? Did it burn itself out? Is it hiding and going to come back later? I'm going to put money on that one, probably, after what we've seen. But it was one that tended to be like super contagious. And so you had these areas where you had people who were super spreaders. And so this was an example of a super spreader situation. You had a hotel, I believe in Hong Kong, and the primary patient, like patient 0 in this hotel, stayed in the green room. People in the blue room all got SARS. And they found the viral particles in the hallway outside of this person's room and in the elevators, in the elevator area. So this one patient infected a lot of other patients. So again, it hasn't been seen since about 2004. It did go worldwide, but the majority of cases were over here in East Asia. So China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore were the most hit, but there were some cases in Europe, some cases in Canada, and even a handful in the US. And so we don't really know, like, where did it go? Did it burn itself out in people? Was it just not that well adapted to people that it couldn't persist in the human population? Does it still exist in an animal reservoir and could come back? Or is it gone? It's really hard to say. I mean, it's been almost 20 years. So even though I was joking that it'll probably come back, it's probably gone. It probably burned itself out, like that particular virus. But does that mean related viruses are gone and have burned themselves out? No. And if you travel at all ever to the National the Smithsonian Science Museum, or the Museum of Natural History. I like to call it the Science Museum, but whatever, it's the natural history. You can actually, they have exhibits about infectious diseases and how they spread, and so they have one about SARS, and one of the interesting things is, again, how much there were these super spreaders where one person infected, all of these other people, and they had these clusters. So they believe it probably originated in bats, but they're not sure. So the next coronavirus that just kind of popped out of nowhere, they ended up calling Middle East respiratory syndrome. Sometimes they called it the camel flu, but it actually was isolated from bats. Now, when we name viruses, we try really hard not to name them after regions of the world because it causes some bias, right? Like there were people who were calling COVID like the China flu. Like that's not what it's called, right? Like so what if the first person was found in China? That doesn't mean anything, right? So we try not to anymore name viruses after places. We try to name them what they are. They have a real name. So isolated from bats. It has been diagnosed in all of the countries shown in red. The two countries that were most impacted, which again is why this is not the most accurate name, Saudi Arabia, where, Saudi Arabia is in the Middle East, and South Korea, which last time I checked is not in the Middle East. So it's not a terribly accurate name, but that's fine. It was first identified in April of 2012, so about 10 years after SARS, here comes this one. And since then, there still have been cases. This one hasn't completely disappeared. Periodically, a case or two will pop up. There were about 2,600 cases, but look at that mortality rate, 36%. Nearly a third of patients who get this one will die. So this one is really virulent. And again, when you start thinking like a health professional, when the virus causes that high of mortality, is that a good evolutionary strategy? Something like Ebola as well, that has like a 90% mortality. Is that a good evolutionary strategy? Maybe not. If you kill everybody before the virus can spread, whoever gets infected is probably going to die. Like that's evolutionarily not great because then you lose your host. So the symptoms, these might look familiar. Fever, muscle pain, cough, shortness of breath. You can have vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain. Right? And then we get to everybody's favorite. Okay, SARS coronavirus number 2. That's what the virus is called. We call the disease COVID-19. Coronavirus disease 2019.
So when we got in 2012, it was like not that bad when we got in 19.
Say that again?
So in 2012, you said we first find out for coronavirus, right?
That was MERS, the Middle East respiratory syndrome in 2012. COVID-19 is a different one. It's a different virus. Yeah. So it's called coronavirus disease 2019, COVID-19. Because patient 0 reported symptoms on December 1st of 2019 in China. The first case was diagnosed in the US just under 2 months later, January 20th, 2020. And I believe that was a patient in Washington State. So of course, like as a microbiologist, I'm watching it going, this is not good. And it was not good. Okay. There have now been confirmed cases in all countries except North Korea and Turkmenistan. I don't know what's up with Turkmenistan. I don't know. North Korea, I mean, let's be real. Nobody goes to. Well, I would bet like my life savings that they have COVID-19 in North Korea. But they're never going to report it. That guy's like, no, North Korea's great. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Okay, Kim Jong-un, it's great.
So it's maybe because nobody like traveled there, or?
Oh, the people travel there. I'm sure they've got it. Like, there are only certain countries that can't travel to North Korea. Like China can travel to North Korea. Russia can travel to North Korea. So they actually have a decent tourist industry, weirdly enough. Not on my bucket list of places to visit. But
What about the last country, the one you mentioned?
Turkmenistan, they probably just aren't reporting it.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
I'm sure they have it. Because
It was close by Afghanistan.
I believe so. It's kind of in that.
There they had it. Like
Yeah.
a lot of people died.
Yeah.
COVID-19.
Yeah, I think they're just not reporting it.
Oh.
They're like, yeah, we don't really need to play your game, so we're not going to report it. I feel like the North Koreans have denied it, that it's not there, but I'm like literally, North Korea and South Korea, they share a border, and those people are like right next to each other in that demilitarized zone, and plus people travel to North Korea, so I'm like, yeah, you have it. So this is the most recent data I pulled from the World Health Organization. Worldwide, there have been 770 million confirmed cases. Of course, I think that's going to be a lot higher because a lot of people got it and never went to the doctor and never had like a laboratory diagnosis. Like my whole family got it, so you can add, and plus my parents, so you can add 6 more onto there. We never went to the doctor. We took the at-home test, and I'm like, cool, that's COVID.
So those people cannot, they're not came on this.
They're not counted on there. No, yeah. And then almost 7 million deaths, much lower mortality rate, hovers around 1%. So COVID-19, of the 3 coronaviruses that cause more significant disease, so SARS, MERS, and COVID-19, this one has the lowest mortality rate, about 1%. Again, worldwide, as reported to the World Health Organization, there have been 13.5 billion vaccine doses administered. Now, that is much higher than the population of the world, and that is a good thing because that means that people have gotten boosters as well. So that would include boosters. Okay, I am also responsible for like 4 of those. Yeah. Actually, have I been? Oh, no, I have. I've got 5. Never mind. I've got 5. Yep. I'm like, just give it to me again. Give it to me again. I'll take it again. So in the U.S., what we're looking at overall in the U.S., total deaths, 1.1 million. Yeah. So, when people want to say, oh, like, okay, well, if you think like 1.1 million people dying is not that bad, I guess then it's not that bad. But for me, I'm like, that's 1.1 million families who lost somebody. That's really sad. So I think that's bad. That's just me. Total hospitalization, 6.4 million. So if you made it to the hospital, your odds weren't great. And I think we remember that, like especially people who got put on ventilators. I know personally one person who got put on a ventilator and he actually pulled through, and it was really surprising that he made it. And it was only because he was like in his 40s instead of older. But I also know somebody who was in their like late 30s that died. So you never know. Okay. Percentage of the total population of people who are up to date with COVID vaccines is not good. There are only a handful of states that have a higher than 25% rate of people who are up to date on their vaccines. So Washington, Minnesota, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, all those tiny little states that they cram up there. And then Maryland and Washington, D.C. have higher than 25%.
So it's like the old people that their rate was high because of their immune system, but there's a lot of young people that are not.
Yeah, so older people and very young children would die because they don't have a very good immune system. Usually when younger people would die, they might have had like a complicating factor. Like the person I know that died, he was diabetic and he didn't control his diabetes very well. He thought, oh, I'm skinny. Like it doesn't matter if I have diabetes. I'm like, that's not really how diabetes works. And unfortunately,
Okay, so they had some issue.
yeah, oftentimes there was some complicating factor. And then, there are those people who are the vaccine deniers. So on top of being diabetic, he was also, COVID's not real. And I'm like,
Your kid got COVID?
oh, my kid's got it, yeah. But he thought COVID wasn't real and he left 2 kids behind. You know what I mean? Like,
Didn't care.
yeah. Well, people got really into their political beliefs and distrust of the government. And that's what happened.
So do we have to get those 5th dose?
No, I mean, I think what they're recommending now, it's going to be a lot like a flu shot where you get a booster every year. So if it's been more than a year since you've had a booster, that they would recommend that you get it again. So again, California's decent, between 20 and 25% people are up to date. And then, they're selecting for themselves at this point. I'm just like, but that's fine. That's fine. And these are going to be very familiar to any of you who have had COVID-19, which probably is most of us. Fever, loss of appetite, fatigue, loss of smell, and in some patients that never really came back. My uncle lost his sense of smell and he said it's still not great. He can smell some things, but a lot of things he can't smell anymore. Shortness of breath, cough, sometimes you coughed up sputum, sometimes it was a dry cough, muscle aches and pain. Hopefully most of us did not have severe disease, but if you did, or if you were close to somebody who had severe disease, they may have had difficulty waking and confusion, so mental symptoms, really significant difficulty breathing where they're not getting enough oxygen, so you'd see bluish lips, coughing up blood, persistent chest pain, reduced white blood cells, kidney failure, high fever. So those are the symptoms that, and again, I know people always made a big deal about loss of taste and smell, but the majority of patients actually didn't experience that, 15 to 30%. And if you were vaccinated, I could say I had a fever for about 12 hours. That was it. I didn't lose my appetite. I did feel tired. I had some cough. But I felt better. Probably 2 or 3 days later, I felt totally fine.
Was that a headache one of them too?
You can sometimes get a headache. I didn't get a headache either.
I never had a worse headache in my life than when I had
Yeah. It could be a combination too, like if you were dehydrated, like if you didn't drink and you had a fever, like that can like totally cause a headache. Yeah. So again, common symptoms. I think we know all this, at one point, like you got in public and people were coughing and you were like, go home, I remember like when it first was happening, they made us wait in line to go to Target. It was like when you couldn't get toilet paper and stuff. And so I'm standing out there in line at Target and some lady was like right behind me. Like she was too close. I'm like, 6 feet, lady, 6 feet. Good times living through a pandemic. For the majority of patients who have a coronavirus, you're not going to try to diagnose it. They're probably not even going to come to you because they have a cold. However, if you were going to try to diagnose a coronavirus infection, you would only do so if the patient had something like SARS, which we haven't seen in 20 years, MERS, or COVID-19. And again, a lot of your COVID-19 patients are probably not going to turn up at the clinic. They will most likely take an at-home test, and I am a firm, will you recommend this? Yes, doctor on demand. Like if I don't have to go in person to see a physician, if I can talk to the doctor on the phone, yes, it's like video chat, right? If you've ever done it, it's wonderful. What are they going to do for you? If I'm like, here's my positive COVID test, if I go to the regular doctor, it'll take me 3 days. I have to sit in the waiting room and they're still going to do the same thing. Might as well call doctor on demand. The only time I've gone to the regular doctor lately is because my kid scratched my eyeball. They can't diagnose that over the phone. They have to look at it. Reverse transcription PCR is the classic, like in the doctor's office, in the lab diagnosis. Generally of a respiratory sample. So, right, the swab up the nose. What they also are doing now is a lot like what they do for polio, where they monitor the wastewater for polio. They monitor the wastewater for COVID-19 because the virus can be shed in feces, right? It survives the GI tract. And when they start to see a high viral load in the sewage, in the wastewater, they know that it's probably going to be a lot of people turning up at the hospital, at urgent care, at the doctor's office with COVID-19. Okay, you generally don't want to culture them. These are mostly considered biosafety level 3 organisms. Prevention is difficult. I mean, it's an upper respiratory tract infection in a lot of people. How do you stop people from leaving the house? Quarantine and screening of patients from infected areas. As we saw, that was pretty much an epic failure. How many grown people don't know how to put a mask over their nose? I'm like, seriously? This is not effective. Grown people, adult human beings. I'm like, it's over your, they would probably die on an airplane because they wouldn't put the thing over their mouth and nose, right? That's fine, just don't sit next to them. Okay, we do know that we have vaccines. There are 2 major RNA-based vaccines put out by Pfizer and Moderna. They work by inducing your cells to produce the spike protein that's on the surface of the virus. So you would generate an immune response against the spike protein. The 2 scientists who really investigated this idea of using mRNA to vaccinate people, not just against COVID-19, but against a lot of other things, they won the Nobel Prize 2 weeks ago. Whenever they announced the Nobel Prizes, they won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. There was a DNA-based vaccine put out by Johnson & Johnson. It also is effective. However, it's no longer recommended in the US. There was a risk of blood clots associated with the vaccine. There's also a protein subunit vaccine, which is more of a classic vaccine technology made by a company called Novavax. I've had Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. I need to go get Novavax next time, so I can just say I've got all of them, but I've got the whole collection. Okay, so Johnson & Johnson was one that they were doing as a single dose. So a lot of people chose that because it was a single dose instead of the double that you needed with Pfizer and Moderna. So remember, if you first got a Pfizer or Moderna, you had to go back 21 to 28 days later to get your second shot. With Johnson & Johnson, it was just one. So I did that because I was pregnant, and I saw everybody that got one of the Pfizer or Moderna, they spiked a super high fever when they got their second one, and fevers are dangerous during pregnancy. So I was like, well, whatever, I'll just do that one. And then a week later, they're like, it causes blood clot. This is fine. Everything turned out fine. Okay. There's also a treatment available if you are diagnosed with COVID-19. So this is why some people will still seek medical care. And generally, Doctor on Demand could prescribe this to you as well. It's called Paxlovid. It's a combination antiviral therapy. There's one drug in there that's a protease inhibitor. It helps to prevent viral replication. There's another drug in there that's a second protease inhibitor, and it's sometimes used to treat HIV or hepatitis C as well. It inhibits a cytochrome that normally metabolizes drugs. So often what happens is when you take a drug, if it's metabolized by your body in the wrong way, the drug is no longer effective. So even though it is a protease inhibitor, it also basically prevents your body from metabolizing that other drug so that the drug will be effective. Okay, so it's a combo therapy. And again, it does work.
You have to take this drug from the beginning, right?
I think they say within 3 or 4 days of exposure is when you would need to take it. So probably right when you have symptom onset, you could go right away to urgent care or do the, doctor on demand. to try to get that taken care of. Okay, any questions on coronaviruses? Okay, well, it looks like we'll have time to talk about poop. Yes. Yes. Noroviruses are one of the most common causes of foodborne illness. And the first one that was ever identified was called the Norwalk virus because it was isolated in 1968 in Ohio, a town called Norwalk. And they did electron microscopy of stool samples during an outbreak of gastroenteritis. And they could see the viral particles in the stool sample. It didn't even need to concentrate it. It was just full of viral particles. Now, they're small, very small, similar to the P coronaviruses. Very, very small. They have a positive sense strand RNA genome. So again, that genome, once it gets into the host cell, can be translated pretty much right away. And they're naked, which has, again, important implications for how we're going to clear our infection and how we're going to prevent infection. Now, scientists have not yet been able to grow these in cell culture, okay, for whatever reason. Okay, so there are lots of strains of noroviruses. There are some that are human only, and they tend to only infect humans. So this is not something that you're going to get from an animal. You're getting it from another person. And they are very, very infectious. As few as 10 virions, viral particles, can cause disease. They damage the small intestine, which leads to a watery diarrhea. They can also cause vomiting, but not every patient is going to experience vomiting. Shedding of the virus can occur for up to 2 weeks after the end of symptoms. So sometimes public pools and like water parks and things like that will have signs that say if you've had diarrhea within the past couple of weeks, like please don't get in the water, and everybody's like, and they get in the water anyway. And it's because you can still be shedding the virus even when you no longer have diarrhea. There are a high number of strains, and the body just does not generate a very robust immune response, so reinfection is possible. So again, what we see days after exposure, so really, really quick, within a day, fever, loss of appetite, maybe headache, nausea, abdominal cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. This is one of those, I got a 24-hour bug. Yeah, that means you know somebody's at home with diarrhea. Generally, there's going to be a common source of infection. People were infected from eating the same food item. Generally, they visited the same location where somebody was contaminated. It's coming into contact with something that's been contaminated with feces or vomit. That's how GI pathogens are spread. They're resistant to heat and drying because they're naked, so they can remain on surfaces for an extended period of time. And here's the thing. So I told you, as few as 10 virions can make you sick. A person who is in the throes of infection can be shedding up to 100 billion virions per gram of feces. A gram is not very much. So in just 1 gram of feces, a person is shedding enough virus to make the entire planet sick. You can imagine why this goes pretty quickly.
So does that mean that even if a person washes their hands after using the toilet, then they can still even pass it on?
Yeah, there could still be virus. It's a much lower risk than if you don't wash your hands, but yeah, it can still be on there. Generally, what we're talking about with hand washing is that it's like the mechanical action of physically washing. But if, let's say they don't wash their hands well, I mean, the soap is not going to destroy the virus, but if you're not like really wiping your hands well, it's entirely possible. Oh yeah. Question?
I'm kind of confused with the same food item. What do you mean by that?
Like if, say you went to a restaurant and you all eat the same thing and the person who had prepared it had norovirus. So this tends to go around cruise ships a lot because everybody eats at the same restaurant. Like you eat at the buffet. I don't know. I've never gone on a cruise ship. I get violently seasick. But apparently you all eat at the same place. And then you all touch the same surfaces. And you're shutting like that. And people apparently don't know how to wash their hands still. Okay. And asymptomatic individuals can shed. So you no longer have diarrhea. You think, oh, I'm in the clear. That was a terrible 24 to 36 hours. But I'm good now. You're still not good.
So essentially, if somebody has this and they throw up on you,
you're toast. Yeah, absolutely toast.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. If, somebody comes home, your parents went on a cruise and then they come over and you're like, oh, seriously? No. Yeah, my parents like to go on cruises. They haven't been in a while because, pandemic and stuff. But I'm like, if anybody has diarrhea on your cruise, you can't come over for 2 weeks. Okay. But like I said, they haven't been on a cruise in a minute because of the pandemic. All right, so this is an outbreak of gastroenteritis in children who had attended a concert. Infection was traced back to contamination of a specific seating area, bathrooms, and other areas visited by one individual. A male concert attendee was ill prior to attending a concert and then vomited 4 times in the concert hall, in a waste bin in the corridor, into the toilets, on the floor of the fire escape, and on a carpeted area in the walkway. I'm like, waste bin, fine, toilets, fine. Come on, man. On the floor, on the carpet. His family members showed symptoms within 24 hours. That's just you're watching the clock going, all right, I'm next. This is fine. A children's concert for several schools was held the next day. Children sitting in the same section as the incident case and those who traversed the contaminated carpet had the highest incidence of disease, characterized by watery diarrhea and vomiting for approximately 2 days. I'm sure all those parents are like, tell me who this guy is. I'm going to sue him for emotional distress. Reverse transcription PCR analysis of fecal samples from 2 ill children detected the norovirus genomic RNA. Remember, it's an RNA-based virus, so you have to do the reverse transcription PCR. Infected vomit may have up to 1 million viruses per milliliter. Remember, a milliliter is not that much, so think of the last time that you really the volume of that, right? I said I get seasick, right? So I was on a boat a couple weeks ago, so I can tell you about volume here. So only 10 to 100 viruses are required to transmit the disease. Contact with contaminated shoes, hands, clothing, or aerosols may have infected the children. So think about it, right? Especially kids, but even yourself. You're walking, you get home, and you take off your shoe, and you probably grab it by the bottom to pull it off. And then maybe you don't wash your hands right away and you have a snack or get a glass of water. Or they walk through your carpet and then you kind of lay on the floor and play around, right? It's all these habits. You're like, no, I have to change all of my habits because I'm going to get sick. So the encapsulated nature of the norovirus, meaning the nakedness, makes it resistant to routine cleaners. Disinfection usually requires a freshly prepared bleach solution or steam cleaning. So it sounds like they didn't do that. They probably were just vomit. They have probably a standard biohazard cleanup kit and they cleaned it up and that's fine. But obviously it's not fine. Depends on what the infection is. So you can do reverse transcription PCR from vomit or stool. There's plenty of virus in both of those fluids to test. If you do electron microscopy of the stool, you can see the virus. You don't have to concentrate the stool at all. You can directly do a wet mount and then prep it for EM. Most places don't have an EM in a clinical lab, but still you could. There is an ELISA that has been developed, so you could do that too. Generally though, it's one of those things that, when was the last time you had diarrhea for a day or two and you went to the doctor? Now, if you went to Chipotle and you had diarrhea, and like 15 other people who went to Chipotle got diarrhea, then you might go to the doctor and be like, hey, we all got diarrhea from Chipotle, right? And that's what happened before. At this Chipotle right over here. Wait, where's Monte Vista? Yeah, anyway, yeah, it is. It's right there. So the Chipotle right there, the one in Turlock, had norovirus back in like 2013, 2014. Yeah, I was like, oh. And then I moved here and I'm like, oh, it's been a while. I'll give them a pass. It's okay. But in general, not much you can do about it when a patient has diarrhea, especially a viral diarrhea. You just want to keep them hydrated. For an adult to get diarrhea, really not that big of a deal. For children, it's a little bit more dangerous. They can dehydrate more quickly. So you would do rehydration therapy like Pedialyte. You want to make sure that you're getting the electrolytes, not just plain water. Careful hand washing, and that's like, the warm water, the 20 seconds, like sit in there and sing whatever you got to sing to get you through 20 seconds, or turn on your Apple Watch, it'll let you know. Anything that may be contaminated, so if this gets in your house, all the surfaces in the bathroom for sure with bleach. Right? Yes.
Why is it that it can still be spreading like pools if the pools are chlorinated?
There ain't enough chlorine in the world.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, chlorination, they can't chlorinate a pool to a high enough level to stop most of those infections, because then it would burn your eyes and stuff too much. People wouldn't want to swim in it. Yeah. I know, I took my kids for swimming lessons over the summer, and one day they were like, the pool's closed today. And I was like, somebody pooped in the pool. They wouldn't tell us, but I'm sure somebody pooped in the pool. That's why they closed the pool.
Why do you think that the children are more susceptible to dehydration? So
Oh, it's just because they have less fluids to give.
the smaller size.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we see the same thing even with things like cholera, anything that causes fluid loss in children. They're just because they have so much less fluid, because they're so much smaller, they can get dehydrated way more quickly than an adult would. So these are some headlines about norovirus that I found. Nearly 100 swimmers at a Maine beach were infected with norovirus. I would feel like it'd be too cold to go swimming in Maine, but apparently not. Norovirus among North Carolina McDonald's customers was not linked to a different infection that was found in the salads. So it was something else. Norovirus sickens hundreds of students at a Long Island high school. It was from late March of this year. Chipotle agrees to pay a $25 million penalty for 2015 through 2018 norovirus outbreaks, the largest fine ever imposed in a food safety case. They don't know which food item was contaminated. It was probably the cilantro, and it was probably from a distributor. Because they don't really cook the cilantro, they use it to like garnish. If you don't cook it, right? So I still eat the rice, it's still good, I don't care. But that's what happens. So there were lots of Chipotles that had norovirus. I know I was giving Turlock a hard time, but like Boston had it. There were a number of different restaurants that had norovirus, more than you would think. Like, it's not random employees turning up at all these places that have norovirus. It's most likely a contaminated common food source that they got from a distributor. So somebody at the distribution area had norovirus instead. So, okay, questions about norovirus? Don't go on a cruise, don't go swimming in a public pool, don't go to school, I guess. Like,
Basically, norovirus is spread because of the diarrhea and vomiting.
yeah, it's because there's so much virus in those fluids, like in the feces and in the vomit. There are just so many viral particles, and then they're resistant to drying out. So even if like somebody used the restroom in the morning and then you use the restroom later in the day, the virus could still be in there, and the cleaners come at night and clean everything, so all day, right? And the virus isn't going to dry out on the toilet or on the door handle or on the sink handle. So, yeah. I'm like, don't use the public restroom. Sorry, I don't mean to make everybody paranoid, but I kind of do. So the